Hello everybody, hope you're doing well and thanks for joining us for another video. Recently I was made aware of claims made by taboo conspiracies about the German Knickebein system used in World War II. Knickebein was a method of radio navigation that was used by German bombers to achieve a higher degree of bombing accuracy, especially at night when they couldn't actually see their targets. Taboo argues this system could not have possibly have worked on a globe, and so therefore the Earth must be flat. So in this video, we'll cover how the Knickebein system actually worked and why I would argue that not only is Taboo being quite disingenuous with how he's portraying his claims, but that Knickebein really does more to prove the globe than disprove it. Now I'm sure there'll be people commenting asking why am I wasting my time arguing about this? Simply because I find it interesting. Now, I have quite an avid interest in military history, particularly around the World Wars, and I was already familiar with the existence of Knickebein beforehand, but this has pushed me to research it deeper and come away with more knowledge on the subject, and I enjoy learning new things. It's why my streak of using Brilliant.org is now up to 330 consecutive days. With their huge range of classes across maths, science and computing, you're sure to learn something new as well. All the subjects start with the basics and build up gradually, so it doesn't matter if you're a total beginner on the subject or not. The best part about Brilliant for me personally is the interactive animations that allow me to better visualize what the class is talking about. And it will prompt you with questions as you go to see if you're understanding things, and even if you get a question wrong, it gives you a detailed explanation for how to get the correct answer. See how much you can learn by using my link below to get a 30-day free trial, and Brilliant are also offering 20% off an annual subscription for the first 200 people who sign up. So let's begin by looking at Taboo's claims about Knickebein.
British intelligence, led by R.V. Jones, slowly became aware that such bombing beams may have existed, and presented the information to Frederick Lindemann, Winston Churchill's leading science advisor. But Lindemann and others said such a targeting system would be impossible, because the supposed curvature of the Earth would block the high-frequency beams, because VHF waves do not even allegedly bend around the curvature of the Earth.
Dr. Jones took the message to Professor Lindemann, his old tutor and now scientific advisor to Winston Churchill, and tried to persuade him of the serious threat posed by the Knickebein beams. But Lindemann was not convinced, pointing out that at the high frequencies necessary for an accurate beam, the curvature of the Earth would prevent its being directed against targets in Britain.
The first of these Knickebein transmitters was set up on Stolberg Hill near Denmark. Stolberg Hill was located 443 miles away from Derby, England. The hill was only 142 feet high, and the transmitter was 152 feet high for a combined height of 294 feet. Based on the globe map, the Earth's curvature would hide 118,425 feet. In other words, under the globe, a German bomber would need to be higher than 118,425 feet to be within the line of sight of the Knickebein system.
First thing we need to address is Taboo's statements around radio waves not bending. Whenever a wave passes by an obstacle, it diffracts. This is where the wave path radiates out more. There is not an on-off switch with this. Waves don't either diffract or not. Any electromagnetic wave can diffract when traveling between different density mediums, however the amount of diffraction varies depending on the wavelength and the medium in question, with diffraction reducing as wavelength reduces. So higher frequency equals less diffraction, lower frequency equals more diffraction. It's why you can listen to radio stations in your car even when there is a hill between you and the transmitter, because the radio waves can diffract around the hill. And it's why it is harder to get a good TV signal versus a good radio signal when there are obstacles between you and the transmitter, because the TV signals run on a higher frequency and so don't diffract as much. Taboo alludes to VHF radio waves not bending.
VHF waves do not even allegedly bend around the curvature of the Earth.
Except VHF, or very high frequency radio, is a band of frequencies between 30 to 300 megahertz. That's quite a broad range, and in fact Knickebein operated on between 30 to 33 megahertz, so right down at the lower frequency end with the longest wavelengths. For reference, commercial FM radio usually sits between 87.5 MHz to 108, and yet they can easily diffract. So, a radio signal on a globe that's being transmitted beyond the horizon, as it passes the horizon, that is essentially an obstacle, and the signal will diffract slightly, meaning a receiver wouldn't necessarily need to have direct line of sight with the transmitter to actually pick the signal up. Taboo also includes a clip from a documentary that talks about this.
Dr. Jones took the message to Professor Lindemann, his old tutor and now scientific advisor to Winston Churchill, and tried to persuade him of the serious threat posed by the Knickebein beams. But Lindemann was not convinced, pointing out that at the high frequencies necessary for an accurate beam, the curvature of the Earth would prevent its being directed against targets in Britain.
This clip appears to be from a video called The Secret War, which I'll link below, and this is where I feel Taboo is being a bit misleading with his claims. The section he's chosen to include uses Lindemann's initial objection to Knickebein, which states, quote, "At the high frequencies necessary for an accurate beam, the curvature of Earth would prevent it being directed against targets in Britain," end quote. Transmitted signals don't travel in a perfectly narrow beam. They inherently spread out the further away from the source they get, and the lower the frequency, the more the spread. Higher frequencies can remain in a narrower beam for longer. So the problem with using lower frequencies for navigation is that at far distances, the signal would cover quite a wide corridor, and you wouldn't know where you were within the beam. Consider the spreading of radio beams similar to light from a torch. Flashlight for our American friends. If we shine the light at a wall and consider that as the target area, the further away the target is from the light source, the larger the area that the light is landing in. Now consider a plane inside that circle of light. The plane can see the light, so it knows it's within the light beam, but it doesn't know where within the beam it is. It could be in the center, but it could also be near the edges. And this is where Lindemann's initial objection came in. That at the distances from Western Germany to targets in England, for a beam to remain narrow enough over the target area to have been any use for guiding bombers, it would have needed a frequency far too high to get over the curvature of Earth. However, he had a slight oversight that the Germans had actually worked out a way of using a much lower frequency. Back in the early 1930s, German electronics firm C. Lorenz AG had developed a blind landing navigation system called the Lorenz beam, which was installed at many airports and guided planes onto the runway whilst flying blind, such as at night or in bad weather. This system worked by transmitting two alternating signals, one from either side of an antenna, along the flight path for the runway. One side would transmit dot sounds, the other side would transmit dash sounds. If a pilot was approaching off-center of the runway, they would only be hearing one of the signals, and they would know they needed to correct either left or right depending on whether they were hearing dots or dashes. When the plane was in the center line for the runway, they would be in the overlap between the two beams, and the pilot would hear both signals, which combined to produce a continuous beep. So, as long as the pilot kept adjusting their course to keep hearing that continuous beep, they would come down right on the middle of the runway. The Knickebein system used this same principle, but in reverse, flying away from the signal source rather than towards it. Projecting a Lorenz beam away towards a target, if a pilot is on that beam and hearing only dots, they know they are left of the target line and needed to adjust to the right. If they're hearing just dashes, then it's the opposite. And if they're in the overlap of the beams, they will hear both signals producing a continuous beep, and they will know they're on the right flight path. And even though these beams would be spreading out more and more over greater distances, the beams could be angled towards or away from each other to produce a very narrow overlap. So even with a low frequency signal at long distances, the plane could be kept on a very fine flight path. And the second overlapping beam used this same principle but on a slightly different frequency to distinguish it apart. Usually one at about 31 MHz and one at 33. So when the plane entered the second beam, a second radio transmitter tuned to that frequency would hear the second dotted signal, When they hit the center line and the merging in the second signal, they knew they were in exactly the right spot to drop their payload. So it was able to produce very accurate results, but without the high frequencies that Lindemann initially presumed it would need. And the documentary explains that the British were initially stumped by this because they suspected some sort of radio navigation was being used based on captured intelligence, but examinations of captured German bombers revealed nothing out of the ordinary in their equipment. The British were aware of the Lorenz system because it was used in airports around the world, but it wasn't until somebody noticed that the Lorenz receivers on the bombers were actually far more sensitive than what would be required for the relatively short distance at airports that they then figured out Knickebein was using the same frequency signals as the Lorenz system, but at much further distances.
So I asked Cox Walker if there was anything odd about the blind landing receiver, and first he said no, and then he said, but wait a minute, yes, you know, it's much more sensitive than they would need for blind landing. And of course that was it. Effectively, the prisoner had thought we wouldn't spot it because it looked to be an ordinary blind landing receiver, but in fact it was a much better receiver than one needed. It would have the necessary sensitivity, we thought, and so here was the answer.
And funnily enough, the documentary covers Lindemann's reaction to learning about this.
I told him, convinced him on the theory, now, with Eckers's paper, that the beams would bend round sufficiently, that it was in the blind landing receiver, therefore they must be on frequencies to which the blind landing receivers could be set, and therefore we could listen for them. And Lindemann changed completely at that point and wrote a minute to Churchill, warning him that they seemed to have some new system which would enable them, the German Air Force, to bomb us fairly accurately at night.
So Taboo seems rather disingenuous here, including Lindemann's initial assessment from the documentary, but failing to include his later assessment once he'd been presented with all the facts. But Taboo's argument also hits several other issues. His entire rebuttal is based on the figures from two antennas, one at Stolberg and one at Cleve, and how they wouldn't reach Derby on a globe because he argues the beams wouldn't bend. Now, of the two antennas, the one at Stolberg Hill is portrayed as the more unlikely on a globe because the top of the antenna was 294 feet above sea level and 443 miles away from Derby, which would leave 118,424 feet hidden behind the curve of Earth. And so Taboo argues the plane would need to be flying at least that high in order to pick up the signal rather than at the 20,000 feet they actually flew at, because he argues they would need direct line of sight to the transmitter, and shows a quote saying that the transmitters were more or less in line of sight. Although more or less is not in line of sight, it's almost in line of sight. So how much difference are we actually talking about here? Well, as we've already covered, even high-frequency radio waves will diffract to an extent, and more so at the lower frequencies that were used by Knickebein, but just how much diffraction would be needed? Because Taboo's figure of 118,000 feet sounds a lot. Well, the Heinkel HE-111s that used Knickebein had maximum altitudes between 20 to 22,000 feet depending on the variant. So at 20,000 feet, that would put it 98,000 feet below direct line of sight to the transmitter. Sounds like a lot for sure. But Taboo's own video shows that whilst the antenna is 443 miles from Derby, the distance to the horizon from the top of the antenna is less than 21 miles. Meaning once the signal passes the horizon, it still has 422 miles to travel. 422 miles is equal to 2,228,000 feet. So 98,000 foot drop sounds big, but over 2.2 million feet travelled, that's equal to barely more than 2.5 degrees of diffraction. Now, how does all of this suggest a globe rather than flat Earth? Well, let's take a moment to consider the implications of this whole situation, presuming that everything Taboo Conspiracy has said is correct. Britain and Germany were at war, literally trying to destroy each other, and not for the first time. They were doing everything possible to come up with any new technology or technique that would give them an advantage over the other side. So someone in Germany comes up with the idea of Knickebein, that according to Taboo would not work on a globe. Now, do German scientists and engineers think the Earth is flat or a globe? If they think it's a globe, then they have just thought up a system which, according to Taboo, would not work. And they're pretty smart people. They must have figured it wouldn't work, and yet they proceed to waste time and resources building it anyway, and then find to their surprise that it did work. Or had they figured the Earth was flat to come up with the system in the first place? But then what about the British? Yes, some people initially dismissed its existence because they weren't convinced it would reach that far over the curve of Earth. However, others also argued that it would. So either they thought the Earth was a globe and everything they'd developed for the war so far had been based on a globe, much of which would not actually work as intended if the Earth were flat, or did they figure the Earth was flat but knew they had to keep the big secret going, so denied the existence of Knickebein with the excuse of Earth curve to try and hide the big conspiracy, even though it would leave Britain at a disadvantage in a time of war? I mean, in 1943, the British introduced their own radio navigation system to improve their bombing accuracy, a system they called oboe. Oboe actually ran on a higher frequency than Knickebein. Knickebein was around 33 MHz, oboe was up to 200 MHz. The system proved incredibly effective at targets 250 miles away. However, in December 1943, RAF bombers began targeting Berlin, but they couldn't use their oboe guidance for those missions because at over 500 miles away, Berlin was over the horizon of the system. And so the RAF were forced to resort back to just standard guidance and ground scanning radars on board the aircraft. This system was nowhere near as effective as oboe, and the 4-month campaign bombing Berlin was deemed very unsuccessful. In early 1944, the RAF then switched to targeting areas of France in preparation for D-Day, and could resort back to using the oboe system to great effect, which shouldn't have been an issue if the Earth were flat. Unless the RAF were intentionally hindering themselves to try and protect the conspiracy? Now, for me personally, the more damning part of all of this for Flat Earth is radio navigation was not a new thing at the time. As already covered, the Lorenz system was almost a decade old, nor was high power or high frequency radio signals anything new either. And as Lindemann had highlighted with his initial objection, a high frequency beam would have allowed for very accurate bombing, but it wouldn't work on a globe at those distances. So why did neither side try using it? After the fall of France in June 1940, the Germans installed several more Knickebein antennas along the coast of France and Belgium, and Luftwaffe squadrons were relocated to airfields closer to Britain so their fighter protection could reach further. In August 1940, they hit what seems to be the furthest target away from Germany, which were the docks at Liverpool, 400 miles from Cleve and 478 miles from Stolberg Hill. However, it doesn't seem as though either of those transmitters were used for that bombing raid. Instead, it seems they used antennas at Cherbourg and Calais, which are within 260 miles of Liverpool. I've even had a flat earther claim that the antenna down in Mulberg proves the Earth is flat because of how far away it is. Seemingly, they've overlooked that when those original 3 antennas were built in 1939, that was the limit of German territory. They hadn't invaded France at that point, so in fact, the antenna at Mulberg along with the one at Cleve would give excellent coverage over France. If the Earth were flat, the Germans should have just been able to keep using the Stolberg Hill antenna as the crossbeam. There are areas around central France with elevations of 1,500 feet and higher. An antenna there would have had absolutely no obstructions. Germany could have built their main guidance antenna much further south in France, which coupled with the Stolberg Hill antenna would have given them perfect coverage over the whole of Britain. Germany wouldn't have needed to have built multiple new antennas all along the entire Channel and North Sea coast. So why did they? And putting one antenna much further south away from the coast would have helped protect it from potential attacks. And the British oboe system should have reached Berlin on a flat Earth, at most perhaps needing higher power outputs or higher frequencies, and yet they didn't do either. I mean, the whole coverage about the Battle of the Beams is about how the British learnt about Knickebein, jammed it using the same frequencies, which made Germany aware that the British knew about it, so they ended up developing 2 new systems called X-Ray and Y-Ray, which used frequencies of 70 MHz and 45 MHz respectively. Both of these were also subsequently jammed by the British using the same frequency, and ultimately the Germans then gave up trying. Why didn't they just use a much broader range of frequencies going much higher up and keep changing them constantly to make them harder to detect? Several years earlier, the scientific director for the German Kriegsmarine, Rudolf Kuhnholm, had been developing a radio system for detecting warships which used a radio frequency of 600 megahertz. So such frequencies could be easily produced. Why not have used them for Knickebein if the Earth was flat? Personally, I would argue that Times of War is about the one time above all else you do not want to knowingly hinder yourself and hand advantages to your enemy by pretending the Earth is shaped differently to reality. And yet, everything about those radio navigation systems, once you look properly at how they were designed and deployed, all point to the Earth being a globe rather than flat. And all of this was more than 15 years before NASA was even founded. Anyway, that's going to wrap it up for today. As always, feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video and you haven't already done so, then please consider hitting the like and subscribe buttons, and then hopefully we'll see you in the next video.